today the game plan is first I'm going to talk a little bit about APIs, some stuff related to APIs like OAuth, tokens, some examples of what you would use APIs for, and then we're going to review the code that we got to at the end of yesterday. For anybody who wasn't here yesterday, we'll kind of go over it, spend some time talking about the components of it, make sure everybody's up to speed on that code, and then we're going to use that as a starting point to go and add the ability to send emails and authenticate through Venmo's API and send people Venmo payments. So to start, you should make sure that you have a download. I created a download which has a starting point and 3 milestones. So if at any point you get behind a bit, you can just look at a milestone ahead of where we are and see where we're heading toward. You can also use that to copy and paste boilerplate code whenever there's stuff like that. And in general, just as reference, if you would like to jump ahead or look around or whatever. So just go ahead and download those files. It's pretty much at the bottom of that page under Workshop 3 section. And then get that open in a text editor. If you're using Sublime, I would just unzip that folder and then add that folder to your project. Under here you can do folder, project, add folders to projects, and just get the entire folder of everything open on your sidebar in Sublime so you can easily look around at everything. And then if you don't have a Venmo account already, I mentioned this earlier, you should try to sign up for one at some point, or pair up with a buddy and do the Venmo stuff with a buddy. So in case I wasn't clear, the expectation is that you can either code along or you can just listen along and peruse the download stuff for the code itself, whichever you prefer. Either just perusing the code at each milestone and looking around as I discuss it, or you can code along yourself. I'm going to code basically from the first milestone to the last one through the course of this talk. So exactly what I'll cover. First, we're going to talk about what an API is, how do they work, how we use them, why they're useful, why we go to all the trouble of interfacing with something that is sometimes tricky to interface with, and what we get out of it. And then we're going to look at 2 kinds of cases of using an API. So a lot of times, APIs will come with wrapper libraries, and there's a package for Node called Node Mailer, which is sort of similar to a wrapper library for sending emails. And so we'll get a little bit of experience using something more like a wrapper library, and then we'll go and do the actual OAuth authentication flow, which is kind of how, if you ever authorize an application on your Facebook, or if you ever authorize an application to use your Gmail or Google account or anything like that, you'll be on the website or the application or whatever, and then you'll click on a link, and then it'll direct you to this little authorized page on Facebook or on Google, and you'll click authorize and allow the app to have these permissions. So that's called the OAuth authorization flow. Also jokingly referred to as the OAuth dance, because the servers just go back and forth 3 times in the process. And the end result of it is that the service trying to authenticate through Facebook or Google, or in this case Venmo, has a token that it can use to act on your behalf with that service, up to the extent of the permissions you've granted it. So we're going to go through how to do that, how to get that set up on Venmo, and exactly how that looks like in Venmo's case. And then we're going to use Venmo's API to be able to send payments to each other. So if you are so inclined to just easily send people a penny over and over and over to flood their inbox, or to send them text messages, or to otherwise make them consider changing their Venmo notification settings, then you'll be able to do that. So a few things, just from what we covered yesterday, basics of Node.js, storing data in sessions, and creating and processing form submissions. So as I mentioned, we're going to use yesterday's starting point, or yesterday's finishing point to start today. And we'll start by just going through exactly the code that was the endpoint of the download file from yesterday. I'm not going to go through the exact code that we ended up at yesterday, because some things kind of diverged and it wasn't exactly the same, but it's pretty much the same thing. And we'll just go over it, talk about the components, and I'll answer any questions about Node.js or sessions or any other parts of that code before we get started, just to make sure that nobody's lost before we even go anywhere. And I had more on this slide, but I made it 2 slides. Okay, so an API, what is an API? It's this acronym, you've heard it a whole bunch. It stands for Application Programming Interface, but that still doesn't tell you a whole lot. basically, it's a way for between any two components of a program or pieces of software, for whatever you consider to be a piece of software, to plug a wire between them for them to communicate. So in some cases, this can just be one module that you include in a project, and then you say that that module has an API by which you access it. So you're using an API, but you're not going over the internet or anything. It's just like another module that you're plugging into your program. But in the case where we talk about it in hackathons, usually we're talking about using some sort of web-based API where we make requests to a set of endpoints that some company somewhere providing some service that we find useful has created and provides for us. So basically it lets us just talk to some other program and communicate and hopefully get something useful out of it. And a few examples of whose APIs we might find useful to talk to in the context of a hackathon. Venmo, which is what we're going to do today. Quite a few top 10 pen apps hacks in the past have used Venmo's API in different ways. It's just normally doing things with money is difficult, and Venmo makes that pretty easy. So people like to use Venmo. Dropbox lets you deal with storing files, lets you automatically hook into a file system that people already have. Dropbox's API is pretty easy to work with. Twilio, once again, Twilio is sort of along the lines of Venmo, where text messages and phone stuff are otherwise really hard to do, and Twilio makes that easy. So people use Twilio for sending texts, or for calling people, or for anything involving phones. And then some more typical ones like Twitter, or Spotify, or RDO. And you can look at all kinds of past hacks and see what APIs they used if you go and look at old pen apps websites. So exactly what we're going to do by the end of this is send emails using a Node package called Node Mailer, and then we're going to do all that OAuth flow stuff with Venmo. There will be a nice diagram and talk about it. And then we're going to use, as I said, the Venmo API. We're going to use one of their endpoints that they've provided to us. We're going to look at their API docs, figure out how to interpret API docs, and figure out how to craft our HTTP requests to Venmo to get Venmo to do what we want them to do for us. So first, let's go ahead and just spend some time going over the code that we're starting from. So how many of you were here yesterday? How many were not here? Okay, so I'll just go ahead and go over it in pretty deep detail, but just make sure you have this downloaded and follow along. So we have a Node app. We have a public folder which just has a style sheet. And we have some views. So we're using a view engine, so whenever we return a page response, we're rendering one of these, replacing all of these mustachy things with variables. And as far as exactly how our app works, we require a bunch of modules up top, things to do logging for us. Express is the web framework we're using. Express does lots of things like handling requests and responses and makes it easy for us to plug in additional functionality. And then we have things for parsing cookies and parsing body information out of the request headers. And then we have session management, which we use to store all of the data that we keep persistent between one page load to the next. And then we configure a template engine where we tell Express that when we do certain things, we want to render these template files, which end up being our page outputs. And then we have some more middlewares of our own. I'm going to just skim over things, and then we're going to look at the website and see how it works, and then we'll come back and talk about this and see exactly which parts are powering which parts of the site. And then here we mount the module ./routes, which is this routes.js file. This routes.js file defines all of our route handlers and basically defines each of the pages that we have and how they each work. And then we just tell Express to use that as our base path routing. And then we have pages at / anything that can be considered an ID value, which really is any string. And we have form submission handler at /create. And then after that we have error handling to catch any 404s, and then we start listening for requests. And let's go ahead and get this running. So if you've just downloaded it, you'll be here. And the first thing we need to do to get a Node app running is npm install. So this will install all of our dependencies, which are specified in package.json. So we specify that the app as it is right now depends on the express, body parser, cookie session, and so on packages. And those are all just modules that other people have made that do useful things for us. In particular, Express is the framework that handles all of the request routing and allows us to plug in things like the body parser and the cookie session. And then Node.js is our template engine that lets us turn one of these basically HTML files with special template syntax in it. It plugs in all of the variables that we get from our Node app and then outputs that as a page for the user to see. And then finally, our last dependency is Morgan, which is just a logger, so that every time we get a page request, we can see it in the terminal. And that hasn't been useful yet, but that's going to start being very useful once we start doing the Venmo authentication stuff. So in the meantime, the npm install finished, and now we have this node modules folder, second from the left, and that contains all of our dependencies that we just downloaded. And now we can do node app.js to start our application. And so it tells us that it's listening on port 3000, so we can go to localhost :3000, and we get our application as it is. So because of how the sessions work, the cookie that my browser has had for the past several days as I've messed around with all of this is still persisting the state of my notes. So I have a whole bunch of notes in here already, but if we didn't already have notes, then we can make a new one, and we can save the note, and then we can go and look at that new note, and we can go back, and we can make a big note, and we can save that note, and we can go look at that note. And of course, I don't actually do anything to turn the new lines into HTML, because that is just something you could do in a couple of lines. But the point is, basically, we have this simple app. It just lists all of our notes. We can click on one of them to get to our note, and then that takes us to the URL / whatever the number of our note is, and then we can go back, and we can create a new note, and this form will go and submit it to the server. The server will process it and add it to the list of notes. So to look at the source of that real quick, we just have a simple list of links to the notes, which was populated from the template by this portion right here, where we basically have this is mustache template syntax for a for loop, and then for each of the notes, it does this and replaces this part with the ID of that note and this part with the title of that note. And then if we didn't have any notes, it would just tell us you don't have any notes yet. And then it gives us this form. The form's action is /create. /create, if we go back and look at routes.js, is where we receive the form post submission. And then when we handle that, we check that a title and a body were provided, and we add to our notes, which we're storing in the session, and then we redirect back to the home page. And as far as how the session works, we have basically in our app, we have require session here, and then we say app.use session. And what that does is that adds a field to our request parameter, which we use in places such as here with rec.session.message, here with rec.session.notes, and here with rec.session.notes, which is basically just data that we can store that is specific to the user browsing our site. So anything that we store on the rec.session object, such as the notes or the message or anything else we would want to store, is basically, because of how we have this set up, it's stored in a cookie that we give to the user's browser with each request, and then every time they make a page request back to our site, they give us that cookie back. And then all of these, the cookie parser plus the session, those plugins basically automatically decode that and populate it into our session object. And so right now, all of our persistent state, which we can think of as all of these notes that we've taken, is just stored in a cookie that's being passed back and forth every time. And that's kind of the focus of the second part today, which is databases. Instead of storing that all in a cookie, we're going to start storing that in MongoDB. So, any questions about the current functionality of the app, the current workings of the app, any of the components, any of the idioms or patterns or anything. Yeah?
Under line 22, there's res.locals.
Uh-huh.
I was wondering about locals. Is that an object under?
Yeah, so res.locals is where, if we look at where we call res.render, so for example, under slash we call res.render, under slash ID we call res.render. If we add anything to the res.locals object, that is the same as if we passed it in this object here. So if basically what we're doing is where we say res.locals.message equals rec.session.message, we say if a session message was passed, which we do in cases like when a form is submitted. Here, if a form is submitted, we set a message, or we set the message that the node got created, and then that goes into the session, is saved in that cookie, gets passed back and forth, and then this middleware, which runs before every request is handled, checks if there's a message that was passed from the previous request, and then if so, passes that to res.locals, and res.locals is basically the context of all of the variables on each template page. So when we go and look at index.hdjs, we say if there is a message here, then let's display that message. So this message is what came from res.locals having res.session set to it, and that originally originated from here. So we can see that working by testing a new note, and we'll see that it'll say note created.
So it's like a local environment variable.
Yeah, it's basically just passing variables to the context of the template that we render.
All right.
Yeah. So normally we just do that in our route handlers, where we do call res.render, and we provide this object which has that context. But anything that's added to res.locals gets combined with this object that we give here, and that ends up being the final context for the template to render. Any other questions about like any of the lines or stuff going on in here before we get started on the API stuff? Okay, cool. So back to the slides. So the first thing we're going to do, this code is completed and working under the MS1 folder if you want to look ahead, but we're going to get NodeMailer working. We're going to do some configuration for NodeMailer, and then we're going to set up being able to send an email to an email address with just a simple form where you type in an email address and then it sends some fixed email to that. So the first thing we need to do, as I put on the slide, is npm install --save NodeMailer. So you can quit the server just by doing like Control-C and I quit, and then we'll install NodeMailer, which is a package that makes sending emails much easier for us. And then I'm going to cheat a little bit. So first, for reference, you guys can feel free to use as your account to send emails from this account that I made for the sake of this demo. And basically, what we do is we log into a Gmail account through SMTP, which is like a mail sending protocol that you can Google and read more about. And then we just have a Google username and password, and obviously you might not want to put in your real Gmail username and password if you value your Gmail account. Not that this code is really going anywhere, but it's just better not to do that when you're just hacking around on stuff. So feel free to use this account, and you can find this under the MS1 folder in mailer.js. And I'm just going to go ahead and save this into the start folder, which is where I'm working everything. So what this file is doing, first we load that NodeMailer module, and then we create a transport, which is, NodeMailer has this idea of a transport, which is a method by which to deliver mail. And in this case, this is just going to be the basic transport with a specified service that NodeMailer already knows about and knows how to connect to. And if we wanted, we could instead have a transport for something like Amazon Simple Email Service, or SendGrid, or any other like email sending utility that we might want to use, or we could even write our own transport that works however we like it to. In this case, we're just using a transport that NodeMailer already has built in to send emails with Gmail. and then we just give it the username and password. So this is just an object that tells the transport how to work. And then what this function does is it creates a transport object that's able to send mails, and then returns it into the variable transporter. And then here we say whenever mailer.js gets required as a module of its own, then its return value should be transporter. So now if we go to routes.js and let's create a test page where we can try out the mailer functionality and check that it works. So we'll make a new handler. And we can require our mailer. So here, this variable mailer is going to end up, we're going to require the module ./mailer.js that we just made here. And it's going to return the transporter, and then this mailer is going to be the transporter that we got returned from that create transport function. And in here, we can do some mail options, and we can do mailer dot, I don't remember the exact calls for it, but let's just go back and refer to milestone 1. Okay, so I'm just going to trim this down a little bit. Okay, so basically the way that sending mail works, we have to give the mailer send mail method a set of options, which basically just specifies the email that we want to send. And then we give it a callback function. And the way it works is, haven't gone into this too much yet, but in Node.js, all of the functions that do like input-output, such as sending an email or sending network requests or accessing a database or reading from a file, anything like that that involves doing input-output operations is done in what's called like an asynchronous model, where you call the function that does it, but that function doesn't give you a return value like you would have in a non-asynchronous language. So, for example, we can't do, you know, in a language that follows a more traditional synchronous, like what you might be used to, we could do something like this, and this info object would tell us that the email, you know, sent to whatever at the time that it sent and whatnot. But in JavaScript, especially in the Node.js model, everything is done with callbacks, which means instead of having a return value from this function call, we provide this function with a second function, and once the function finishes doing its thing, it's going to call the function we give it with the return values. So instead, here we have our info, and we can check if there was an error. And then we can just send the mail, and then this way, between the time that we actually invoke this function mailer.sendMail and the time that the email has finished sending and it calls this function to give us back either the error or the info, our web server can be handling a whole bunch of other requests and doing a whole bunch of other things, and it doesn't have to sit there and wait for the email to finish sending. With a synchronous model, it would just sit there and wait for the email to finish sending. And since we're waiting for a mail server to do that, it might take several seconds, and that would potentially, like, if we have a lot of traffic, that would clog things up a lot. So that's just a little bit of a pattern that's common in Node.js, is having a callback. We're going to see this a lot more once we start making requests to the Venmo API and working with that. But for now, we have this simple endpoint. So if we save this and restart our server, then we should be able to navigate to /email, and we'll get some sort of response, and then we can check. Oh, let's just put an email address here. So feel free to put your own email address right here, and then navigate to /email and see if you receive an email. Hopefully you will. So my email address here, and we can go to /email. And then I'll check my email and see if I got an email. What did it return? Code E envelope. I may have made some sort of just like simple mistake. Let me just make sure that it's actually sending and not having an error, but it's doing the case we want. Oh, I know why. So what happened was I changed this to my own email address, and I think before I did that, I had restarted the server, but maybe that was not it. So I'll restart the server, send an email. There we go, yeah. So what happened was I started the server before I changed this string back to my email address, and so it was trying to send it to a variable that was undefined, and so it got an error. But now it has all these details about having sent the email, and we checked my email, and sure enough, I got an email. So now we can send a basic email. The next thing to do is to do something other than sending a completely static fixed email. Instead, we can create a form, and we can send an email, send a note in the form of an email. So we have all these notes we've created, and now we can go and we can add a button to each note page that says, you know, type in an email address and send this note to that email. So any questions about sending this email, or how the Node mailer library works, or the async stuff? Anything? Yeah? We have mentors here somewhere. That sounds like something that you should have someone write it with you. Sahel? Anybody? Where did Pranav go? There were supposed to be people here to help people with individual questions, but it appears we are lacking today. But maybe Sahel can help you. But anyway, any like more general questions about the code itself, not just like troubleshooting stuff? No? Okay, so let's go back to the slides, check what we did, check what we said we were going to do. So we said we wanted to send something to an email address provided by the user. So before we move on, let's make a form somewhere and make this /email endpoint receive that form, and we can send to the email provided by the form.
Yeah. Is there a more secure way of encoding your credentials into the code rather than hard coding your password?
Is there a way to do that? Yeah, so rather than hard coding my password into the code, there are better ways to do it. We could go through Gmail's API, and we could get a token, and we could do all of the same things that we're going to do with Venmo with Gmail. But this is much easier, and for the sake of not spending an hour just messing with Gmail's API, I'm just doing it this way. But in general, if you're doing a production application, no, having your Gmail password in the source of your file is not the greatest of ideas. And one thing you should be careful of is if you're, for example, if you're using a GitHub repository and you commit your code to a GitHub repository and it's a public repository and then you like push it, then suddenly whatever email account you're using for that is now compromised to the world. So yeah, be careful about that. But in this context, especially like in the context of a hackathon, things that are insecure or unsuitable for the real world can be perfectly acceptable. So make sure to just like ask yourself, is this good enough for my hackathon project? But of course, don't just like apply hackathon logic to real projects. So let's go ahead and right now, question? Oh, okay. So right now, this is a get method. So we just navigate to /email and it sends this email. Instead, let's turn it into a post method. So it'll be the processor for a form submission, and then we can create a form that will submit to it. So we change get to post, and then so let's say that we're going to call the form fields on the form that we're going to create email. So let's build the processor for the form before we build the form, and then once we do that, we'll know exactly how we have to build the form. So we have toAddress. Let's check that toAddress exists, that they actually gave it to us. So if they didn't give us an address, then we should tell them that they have to give us an email address. So following the pattern of doing some sort of check, if the check fails, then send a message of the error, and then redirect back to the home page. So we can say, you must give an email address. And then we can just change the to field here from the static string to be toAddress. And we can also modify the sendMail method, following the same pattern of creating a message, passing the message through the session, and then redirecting somewhere else. So rather than just sending like the JSON object that we got here, rather than just like sending this back to the user, we can just redirect the user back to the main page and tell them that we sent their email. Any questions about the form processor? So this will handle a form that we submit where somebody just types in an email address and then clicks send, and it sends them an email. Now we just need to go make the form for that. So we can just add that to the bottom of the main index template. We can make a new form. Thanks to HTML5, we can now do input type equals email, and the browser will like validate that it's a legitimate email for us and everything. A couple years ago, we would have had to do input type equals text, and we would have had to just trust that the user gave us a valid email. And we're also kind of trusting that the user is using our form and allowing us to validate that it's an email. Really, you could just like create a request to that endpoint, and it would mess things up. So that's kind of a security model called like only doing validation on the client side, which is bad, but for hackathons, it's totally fine. For hackathons, you're not going to be demoing the failure cases of your app. You're going to be demoing like the cool things that it does when it works. So again, we are taking shortcuts for the sake of not having to implement a whole bunch of extra stuff that doesn't matter in the context of a hackathon. And then name, what did we decide we would call it? We decided we would call it email. So we'll give it the name email. And we'll give it a placeholder. And then where should our form go to? It should have method post and action/email according to the URL we have here. And then we can say, have a submit button. So if we update that, and we make sure to restart our server for all of the code changes that we had to our post endpoint, and then we come here, now we have this little send an email box, and I will send an email to myself and see if it works. and we get email sent successfully. So let's go check my email and see if I received it. And once again, I received another email. So any questions about the form processing, the form HTML, any of that?
On the form action, is a slash actually necessary? Or like slash email?
So the slash email, it could be in this case just email. The significance of that slash is the slash at the beginning means start from the base URL. If we didn't have that slash, it would mean start from the folder that my URL path is in right now. But in this case, the URL path is also the base directory, so it doesn't make a difference here. But if we had like subdirectory paths in our routing, then it would make a difference. Okay, so we added a little form to our template, and I think that concludes milestone 1. So milestone 1 is pretty much complete. If you look at the milestone 1 code, you'll have almost the same thing that we have right now. Next up is instead of just sending the same message every time, where we send test email and did it work, we can send one of our notes that we created as an email instead. And rather than just adding a box to let you type in a note and send it as an email, we'll instead just add a button to each note page that we already have, so we could potentially send one of the notes we've already created as an email. So all we really need to do for that is move this form onto each of the note pages, which we can do by just going to our note template. So we're going to have to tweak it a little bit, but in general, we're just moving the send an email form to our note page instead of on our main page. And then we just need to tweak around our submission processor a little bit to figure out which note it is, and then pull that note out of the session store and populate that as the title and body of the email instead of the fixed string we have. So first, the main thing that we're going to have to know here, particularly for this slash email processor, is we're going to have to know what note we're trying to send. So we have all of our notes like labeled by number, where if we go to here, for example, this is note number 11. So we need to have some way to communicate what the note number is. The first thing we should do is add some way to pass that note number through. So there are a couple of ways to do it. The first one is we can modify the route that we do for our email submission to have a parameter, much like we have under /:id. We could do, for example, /email/:id. And then the page, the form would change its action to be /:id. The other option is we could have a hidden input field. We could add a hidden input field to our form. For example, we could do something like that, and then we would just have ID as another value on rec.body, which we process to send the email. So there are a couple of ways to do it. Let's go ahead and do it with a hidden form element. But really, it's going to be about the same amount of work for either one, and it's going to end up working in the same way for either one. So just a couple of different ways to approach the same thing. But the important part is that we just need to pass that ID through. So we receive our node ID, and here we just need to do something to get this value of the ID. So conveniently enough, the note object, if we go back to where we actually create our notes and add them to the session, we pass an ID right here. So part of our note object is an ID, which is exactly what we need. So in our template, we can just say, we can just use the mustache syntax to do the variable node.id. then now, if we go back here to where we send the email, instead of sending a fixed string, we can just pull it off of rec.session.notes, which is our list of notes, and then we can index into it. And we can use its title. And again, we can use that node ID to look up the note that we want to send. And we can do, instead of its title, we'll do its body. And at first, it might seem like that's all we have to do. We should add some error handling to make sure that the ID we get is actually a legitimate note. But there's also a subtle sort of bug here, which you might pick up on if you notice that this first note has ID number 1. So does anybody have any ideas? Help me fix this bug. Node ID minus 1, exactly. So for the sake of looking nice to the user, we added 1 to our node ID back here, so that the node ID of the first node would be 1 instead of 0, because real people don't count from 0. Only programmers count from 0 generally. So we added 1. So we just need to subtract 1 to get that offset to go back to 0 indexed arrays in JavaScript. And then let's also add a little bit of validation to check that the node ID we got is actually legitimate. So we can say if there's not a to address, or if, for example, actually, you know what? First, forgot a step. So in JavaScript, we have types. In particular, anything that's submitted through a form is going to be a string. So even though this is always going to be a number, we know it is because of how we populate the hidden field on the form, we need to actually turn it into a number as far as JavaScript is concerned. Otherwise, when we try to use it as an array index, it's not going to work. It's going to try to use it as a key to look up in a table. So we just need to convert that into a number. And then we can just say if node ID is greater than the number of nodes we have, or if it's less than 1, then we know that it's not going to work. There's also this whole not a number thing if somebody types in a non-number, but again, that's basically just going to be if somebody were to try to send a request to our /email endpoint by not using our form, but instead by creating their own request and putting in values that we're not expecting, then we could potentially get not a number values, which is where if we do, when we call that number casting function here, then if we can't easily convert it into a number, then it'll be a special value that JavaScript has, which is called not a number. And then we'd run into that problem, and we should also check for that. But again, hackathon philosophy, if that case isn't going to happen, then let's not worry about it. But again, if you're trying to build a really secure application, that's something you should think about. So, all of that, let's give it a try and see if we can send a note to ourselves. So let's restart the server. And we refresh. We'll go to this note. My note is test test, and I will send it in email form to myself. And I sent the email successfully. And I received the email test test. So that is the end of milestone 2. Any questions about emailing stuff? Okay, so this is where we shift gears and we talk about doing things without a wrapper that deals with all of the requests and all of the responses and all of the nitty-gritty details for us, and we deal with all of those ourselves, and we craft our own requests to send to Venmo, and we create ourselves a Venmo API authentication flow. So first, we're going to authenticate with Venmo. We're going to do that by sending requests. There's a nice wrapper library for Node.js called request, which will make it really easy for us to craft our own like form requests or get requests or whatever we need to do to send server requests to Venmo. So we should npm install that. And then we can come back and talk about OAuth and other stuff a little bit. Okay, so specifically, OAuth is kind of a spec for how flows work to exchange credentials and details and whatnot. First things first, let's go to Venmo's. Let's go to Venmo and find some details. So Venmo has all of these API documentations, and the first thing we need to do OAuth authentication is a client secret and a client ID. So let me log in real quick. And we can go to the account tab and then go to developers. And it'll say your applications. For most of you, this is probably going to be 0. Or you can click on new and get a new application. And then once you create a new application, you can scroll down and see the secret and the ID for each of those. So these are basically two of the main components of the OAuth dance, and we need these before we can do anything. So let's go ahead and make a small note of these first. And we'll keep those around for later. And then we'll talk about how we're going to use each of these two things. So, going back to the flow of, say you have an app that, for example, wants to authenticate through your Facebook and be able to do things on Facebook as you, or just wants to be able to look at all of your stuff on Facebook. Maybe that thing that tells you what your friend's social network looks like and makes you like a nice pretty graph to look at, or any number of things. So when you do that, you click on it, you say, okay, authorize with Facebook, and then they do this first part, which is redirect the user to the provider. In this case, the consumer is us making the app that works on the API. The user is the person making use of it, which is somebody like trying to log in and authenticate. And the provider is Facebook or Gmail or Venmo in this case. So when they click on that link, first we're going to have to redirect them to a special URL that Venmo has to get authorization, and then Venmo will give our user a page that says, do you authorize this application code weekend demo to have the following access to your account? And then once that happens, the user hopefully clicks yes, and then Venmo will redirect the user back to our application. And when that happens, Venmo is going to give us a special temporary code, and we're going to take that code, and at this point we're back on our server, so that the user is no longer seeing this whole part right here. So from our server we have our client ID, and we have our client secret, and we have the code that we got from the user clicking yes, and we take all of that, and we send it back to a different endpoint on Venmo's server, and we say, Venmo, hey, I have this access token that the user allowed me to have, and here's my client secret to prove that I'm really the app that I'm trying to authenticate as, and here's my client ID. Please give me an access token for this user. And then Venmo gives us back an access token, which is another random string of stuff. And I should turn on caffeine. And as long as we have that access token, we can make requests to Venmo and Wow, okay, my screen is so small that I can't get to the caffeine icon. Okay, I'll just make sure to keep touching my touchpad, I guess. So anyway, we're going to give back an access token ultimately, is what this last arrow back to our side is going to be. And that access token, we hold on to that, and as long as we have that, we can make requests to Venmo's API on behalf of the user in order to do things like send payments, or see their friends, or see their balance, or whatever else they've granted us access to do. So in this case, we're just going to ask for access to see their basic profile information and to send payments as them. And then we're going to make a nice little form that lets us do that. So one detail that I omitted, when we redirect a user from our app to Venmo, we also include our client ID. So Venmo is able to identify the client ID through that ID, and then once we give it our secret key on the second request, then that's how they know that we really are who we say we are. And through all of this, it's basically saying that we have to have trust on behalf of Venmo and on behalf of our application and on behalf of the user for all of this to work. So it's a bit of a long process, but any less than that, and there would be ways for people to introduce security problems or just like properties of the system that make it as usable as it is would go away. Any questions on like how the OAuth flow works? Like this is what we're going to implement on Venmo using requests right next after this. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, this whole thing is called the OAuth dance. So you can just say that you're doing the OAuth dance with Venmo, if that is amusing to you. Oh, I had another slide. Maybe I forgot to compile it. Give me just a second. I added another slide. Here we go. Okay. So a few links that just like give us specific ideas of where all of these pieces fit in terms of Venmo's endpoints. So first, when we say that we want to authorize a user through Venmo, we're going to redirect them to this first URL, really the second URL, but the first URL is just links to Venmo's developer docs. Feel free to jump on there and read around a little bit, read around the OAuth stuff. But I'm going to run you through all of the important parts. So first, we redirect our user to api.venmo.com/blah, blah, blah, blah. We provide our client ID, which in this case I think was 1949. Yeah, it was 1949, so we're gonna put 1949 in there, and then we're gonna ask for the scope to make payments and access profile, and the part that's hanging off the screen is response type equals code, which is just something we have to tell Venmo to give us this code right here back. And then the user is going to go to this Venmo page, they're going to click authorize, and then Venmo will redirect back to us. We're going to create an endpoint of our own for Venmo to redirect back to, /Venmo/OAuth. And that endpoint needs to receive and remember the code that Venmo gives us. And then it takes that code and sends a request to this last piece, access token, code equals whatever. We also send our secret key and our client ID with that. And then Venmo gives us back an access token. And then later on, when the user wants to send a Venmo payment through our app, then we take that access token that we remembered and we send that to the payments endpoint that Venmo provides. And we say, okay, I have this access token, and I want to send a payment on behalf of this user to so-and-so for such and such amount. So is everybody clear on what we're trying to accomplish here? So we're gonna do all of this, and then we're gonna remember the access token, and then we're gonna have a form where you can type in a phone number and an amount and a reason, and click send, and then we'll be able to send Venmo payments. Okay. So, first things first, let's make a new module just for Venmo to contain all of our Venmo logic and also to contain our Venmo routes. So first, we're going to need that request module so that we can easily create HTTP requests. And we're also going to have a couple of routes to implement. We're going to have the endpoint that Venmo redirects back to, and we're going to have a page to hold that form. So let's do like we did under routes.js and have an express router that will return. And then we'll do this, and we'll do so this is kind of the frame of what we're going to do, and then we'll add that to our app by just saying require that Venmo module and mount it at /Venmo. So by doing that, because we mounted it at /Venmo here, then in our Venmo module, if we create a route OAuth, then this will actually be the endpoint /Venmo/OAuth. And that's another configuration part from our Venmo settings. So as part of our app that we created on Venmo, we have a web redirect URL. And right now it's a little bit small. It is localhost 3000 /Venmo/OAuth. So I have my app configured to go to that endpoint. You could configure yours to go to a different URL, and you could change the path. But the important part is that it needs to be a URL that we can write the code behind so that we can capture that code that they send back to us, because we need that code to get the auth token. Okay, so next up, there are a few things that we need to have in our app. We need to have a bunch of these URLs so we know where to send people. Question?
Wait, did you set stuff again?
Repeat which part?
You did something on Venmo.com.
Yeah. So under Venmo.com on our account tab, under developers, we have all the applications we've created. You can click new to create a new one. And one of the important fields is the web redirect URL. And assuming you're following everything exactly as I'm doing it, you should make it localhost 3000 /Venmo/OAuth. So that way, when Venmo redirects, when we click the authorize flow and Venmo redirects us back to the URL here, that's going to be the URL that we implement to capture that code as like the part between step 3 and step 4. So essentially, step 4 is the URL that Venmo is redirecting us back to, and we need to write some logic behind that URL that captures the code that they give us, so that we can take that code and give it to step 5. So let's just make a bunch of URL variables that we can work with. We'll just copy them off the slides. So we have our authorization URL, so that's where we'll direct our user to start the flow where they click authorize. And then we'll have our access token URL, which is where we get our access token. And I think there's one more that we need. Yep. So we have our payment URL. And most of this stuff, I'm probably going to end up stealing some stuff from milestone 3 before much longer, but all of this stuff complete and working with Venmo payments and whatnot is all in milestone 3 folder. So we can give a variable for our client ID and our client secret. So we have all of these, and now we need to implement a few things. So we need to have a dashboard for our Venmo. So we can have just have a simple get page that says for now it'll just be a placeholder, but eventually we'll put a form on there that says how much or what phone number do you want to send it to, and has a link to authorize and everything else. We can have an authorize endpoint. So once we create our Venmo dashboard page and we have a link to authorize with Venmo, then we can have just redirecting to /authorize instead of having to have that giant URL up there in the path. We can just have a handler here that'll redirect our user. So now if anybody goes to /Venmo/authorize, we will redirect them to this Venmo URL, which just needs to have our client ID. And that will be doing, the arrow between 1 and 2 will be that endpoint. So we have our authorize endpoint, we have our placeholder for our page, we have the endpoint for receiving what Venmo gives us back. And the last thing that we're going to need is we're going to need an endpoint for processing a decision to make a payment through Venmo. So we could have, for example, when we submit the form that we're going to create on this page, we need something to process it. So we can do call it /pay, I guess. We can call it whatever we like. So this is kind of the overview of all the components to our system to both have what we need to have a form for actually doing payments and what we need to communicate with Venmo's API. Specifically, the first part is where we capture the code from Venmo and send it back to them to get an access token. The second part is where we redirect a user to authorize our app. Third part is where we're going to build a dashboard, and fourth part is going to actually go to the payment URL and submit a request that will cause Venmo to make a payment on behalf of our user. So any questions about like the outline of what we're doing here? So basically we're going to write a whole bunch of request code in here, and we're going to store some stuff in sessions at some point, and then we're going to make a page that has a big form on it, and that'll be about all we have to do. So going back to our diagram, let's just follow along with what our diagram has. So user grants authorization and redirect back to the application. So our OAuth endpoint, it's going to have .query.code. So in Express, anything that's appended as a query string parameter, where in the URL it's like question mark variable equals value, we're able to access that via request.query. Whatever the value is. So the code that Venmo sends back to us should be accessible like this. And then we need to send a request with the 3 parts, and we can find out exactly how to do that by looking at Venmo's docs a little bit. So we go to the OAuth API. And we look at authentication. So Venmo gives us some examples. We redirect to this URL as we're going to. Venmo will redirect us back to, in this case, localhost 3000 / Venmo / OAuth, and they'll give us the authorization code we need, and then we send it back to here, and they tell us we need the parameters client ID, code, and client secret. So we can make a request. So the way the request module works, you can just do request.post, and then we give it an object which has a couple of fields. It's going to have a URL, and it's going to have a form, which is going to have all those fields that we want. And then the last thing we give it is a callback function, similar to the function we had to handle when the email gets sent. We're going to have a function to handle after the request gets sent and a response comes back. So this will take an error, a response, and a body. All of this is just stuff that you could find out by reading the documentation for the request library. The request library is like extremely standard in Node. You can look it up. It's on GitHub. It's somewhere. But these are the basics of it. You can find out more about exactly how it works by reading its docs. Feel free to look those up. But the important part is we give it a URL. So in this case, we want to send a URL, send a request to the access token URL, is what I called it. And as Venmo told us, we need these 3 fields. So the code here is the code that we got from Venmo sending that request back to us. The client ID here is our client ID, and the client secret is our client secret. And the hope is that when we send them this request, then the body we get here is going to be an access token. And that access token will let us send payments or whatever else that the user authorizes us to do. So once we have that access token, we're not going to be trying to send the payment like right now, so we need to store it somewhere. Does anybody have an idea of like how we could store that? So first, let's look at exactly what Venmo is going to give us back. So they show us we're going to get back this giant object, and it's going to have details of the user that we authorized for. It's going to have our access token here, and it's going to have details of like how long the token is valid for, and a token that we can use to get a new one once this one expires. So this is going to be encoded as a string in the body value. So we can say this is encoded as JSON. So our response is just going to be this giant string. And in JavaScript, conveniently enough, JSON is JavaScript object notation. So we can easily turn that into an object that we can pull individual fields out of just with JSON.parse. JSON.parse is a function specific to the V8 JavaScript engine. V8 is the JavaScript engine that Node is built on, and it also, I don't remember if it's Firefox or it's Chrome. Chrome uses V8 for its JavaScript. And then there's another JavaScript engine called SpiderMonkey that Mozilla uses, and they just like try to be better than each other. But in this case, Node.js uses V8, and V8 gives us this method JSON.parse. So we can make use of that to have our details. And for now, let's just return those details just to verify that the flow ends up working how we want it to. So I think that's all we need to do to test it. One thing I'm going to have to do is clear my cookies somehow. I need to figure out how to do that. Because I've already when I was building this earlier, I already authorized, and I haven't like cleared that in any way. so I need to figure out a way to clear that from my session.
You just do private browsing to open the
That works too, good idea. I'll do that. So trying to find the folder I was in. There we go. Okay, so I get my server running again, and if I go to /Venmo/authorize, which was the endpoint that we made right here. Oops, let me save things. If I go to Venmo/authorize and run it, then our server redirects us to the Venmo authentication page. I need to log in. And I allow it. And then it redirects us back to this endpoint /Venmo/OAuth. And then Venmo/OAuth sent this request back to Venmo, told Venmo, here's the code you gave us, here's my client secret, here's my client ID, can I have an access token? And Venmo gave us back all of this stuff, including the access token that we need in order to act on behalf of the user, which happens to be me. And it also gives us all of this information about my Venmo username and my name and all of that. So what we know is that right here, we can just do something to remember that access token. So if we just take that access token and any other details that we find relevant and we store them in our session object, then we'll have that around later so that after we create our form, we can have that access token in order to actually send our payment. So any questions about this whole OAuth authorization flow? So what we have accomplished at this point is the entire OAuth flow as depicted by this slide. So we have created this connection effectively. We have received the access token that we need, and the next step is to make a request to this payments endpoint and give it that access token. And we won't do that until we go and make our payment form. So let's go ahead and save in our session, save something called Venmo, and we'll just make that be body dot details. So we parse into details, so we can do details.user and details.access token. And we can also send a message that says that we successfully authenticated with Venmo. Okay, so this way we store in our session an object called Venmo, which is going to be the user, so we know who our person is, so we can say that you're authenticated as so-and-so, and we also have our token so that we can take that token whenever we try to do a payment and give that to Venmo so that Venmo knows that we're authenticated and we're allowed to send payments. And then we'll redirect to our Venmo dashboard, which we haven't built yet. So the next step after this is going to be to make a simple Venmo dashboard and check whether our person is authenticated and give them a form by which they can send payments. Doing it on time. So next up, let's make Venmo.hjs. We'll start off with we'll start off with our index.htjs, and we'll just copy this and start with a duplicate of it and modify it to be what we want. So for our title, we'll say Venmo dashboard. If we have a session message, then we'll display that session message. And then let's think about what we're going to pass to this template first, and then we'll figure out what variables we can display through our mustache template. So on here, we can say, we'll render the Venmo template that we're working on, and we'll give it, we can say, we'll just give it the Venmo object, and if the Venmo object doesn't exist, then we'll give it an empty object. And then in our template, we can check if that Venmo object is there, and if it is, we can say, hi, you are authenticated as username, and if it's not, we can say, you are not authenticated, click on this link to authenticate. So from here, we can say, mustache syntax for all of that is pound Venmo and caret Venmo for the not authenticated case. So this other stuff that we don't need. So we'll leave the make a new note form. We'll just modify the make a new note form into the send a payment form once we get there. But for now, let's just get this page to display whether or not we're authenticated. If you look at this object that Venmo sent back to us, so what we stored in the session is just the user. In the Venmo object that we're passing to the template is just this piece. So we can do Venmo.displayName to get the name of the person, and we do Venmo.username to get their username. And then we'll also only show the send a payment form if you're already authenticated. Okay, so right now we have Venmo dashboard, and if you're authenticated, we'll say that you're authenticated, and we'll show a form that doesn't do what we want it to yet. And if you're not authenticated, then we should link you to the authenticate, and we need to make a link for that. So we can do ahref is so here's where the observation of the leading slash mattering or not mattering comes back. In this case, we can just do authenticate, and because we didn't use a leading slash, then this authenticate is just going to go from the directory we're already in, and since this page is going to be localhost /Venmo, then it'll go to /Venmo/authenticate. Or we could do it as do the complete path from the beginning, and we could do it like that. Either one will get us the same result. And if we save that and we restart our server, and we go to /Venmo, oh, whoops. So we ran into a nifty problem. That problem is that we tell our app about all of the routes defined in routes before we tell it about the Venmo routes. So what happens is, when we try to go to /Venmo, it registers that as trying to go to the note with ID Venmo. So we just need to flip the order of those, and everything will work okay. Because the routes that it tries them in the order you specify them. So sometimes you have like routes that collide, so you just need to be careful with that. So if we specify Venmo first, then hopefully we'll get what we want. Okay, so we have the Venmo dashboard. It looks like maybe something's not working for having the username and whatnot, but it looks like we're at least able to tell if you're authenticated. So let's figure out what's wrong with that. Okay. So we need to refactor our logic for the Venmo in the session existing a little bit. So we can say if we just refactor it like this a little bit, we should be okay. So if we check this in this window where I already have everything set up, still an error.
Did you do like user.displayName?
I think what happened was when I saved it, I didn't do .user. Or I did. So I saved in my session, right.session.venmo is details.user. And details should be that. So, but here I console logged my session object, and it is .user, but shouldn't be. Okay. I think what's going on is when I first implemented this, I might have done it. I might have not done .user. I might have just done the whole thing and then done .user somewhere else. So it's tripping on my existing session. So let's go ahead and just make this be details, and we'll extract the pieces that we need when we actually need them instead of piecing it out when we store the session data. So when we go here, we can say so we'll call it Venmo user instead, and then here you can say Venmo user. So instead, we check if our Venmo on the session exists, and if it does, we set Venmo user. Otherwise, Venmo user is false. So that way, in our template, when we get to here, we'll identify if there's no Venmo user or if there is a Venmo user, and hopefully this will work now. There we go. Okay. So here I'm already authenticated as me, And if I go here, I am not authenticated. I can click here to authenticate. I think it was actually supposed to be authorized, not authenticate. Okay, so yeah, we just made the root /authorize, not at /authenticate. I mixed the two words up. They start very similarly. So if we fix that, click here, I get Venmo, I can log in. I successfully authenticated, and now all that's left to do is create a form for making payments and create a processor that takes that payment and sends a request to the payment endpoint. Any questions about what we've done so far? About any of this or this? Okay, so let's make that form. So we can change our payment. So our action will be pay, and that'll go to /Venmo/pay. So at this point, you can feel free to just go into the milestone 3 folder and copy all of this out of there. It might be easier than just retyping all of it. So we'll have an amount, we'll have a phone. So we can send things to Venmo via email address or via phone number or via Venmo user ID. But Venmo user IDs are a string of 20 numbers, so they're hard to remember and we don't know them. And basically, if we were to use our access to grab a user's friend list, then we can keep track of the user IDs from that friend list and give a listing of Venmo friends and say pick a friend to send your payment to. But instead, we'll just say type in a phone number. And we'll make a text box. So if we save that, oops, I did all of that on the wrong template file. There. So let's do that all right here instead. So we change our form around to have payment type fields. We have an amount, we have a phone, we have a reason, and then we can just add to our form processor here to receive the amount, form, and reason, or amount, phone, and reason. And then we just need to construct a request, much like we constructed a request up here. We construct a request to send to that person through Venmo. So we can do request.post, and then let's go look at the Venmo docs and find out what that request should look like. So they tell us the access token, we need the access token, we need a phone, a note, and an amount. So access token, phone, amount, and note. So since this is through a regular form, we're going to have rec.body. dot amount and dot phone and dot reason. So we can just pull those off. We can say and then let's just do a quick check that those were all provided, because if we don't have all three of those, then Venmo's going to complain. So we can just say if not all three of them, then we'll send a message and we'll send you back to the Venmo dashboard. Otherwise, we'll create this post, and the URL we need to go to is this payment URL that we have from up here. So we'll go to the payment URL, and we'll provide the access token, which is going to be in rec.session.venmo.access token. Because we stored that from here, where we store that in session, and we pull the access token off, and then our phone is our phone, and so on. And then we just need our handler for when Venmo sends us back a response indicating whether the payment succeeded or not. So if the payment succeeds, if we don't get an error, then we'll say payment succeeded. And we could like go through and say we sent this much money to this person and whatnot. The object that Venmo gives us back here in body is going to have information about who we paid, so we could parse that. So we parse that just like we parsed when we were sending a request for authorization up here. We parse it, and I don't remember the exact path to get to the field we want, but we can look in the milestones to see that. So it looks like if we do .data.payment.target.user, then we can find out who we paid. So we can say we sent a payment of amount to person, which is determined by when Venmo comes back and gives us the person. And then we can redirect. So we parse the response, we figure out who the payment went to, we set that as a session message, and then we redirect back to /Venmo. And if that doesn't work, if there's an error, then we can just send a message saying there was an error. And again, redirect to /Venmo. So what we did here, we have a form, we submit an amount, a phone, and a note. We take that and we add our access token from the session to it that we got from authorization. And then we send that to Venmo's endpoint at /payments. And we receive the response, we parse the response to find out who we paid or to check an error, and then we redirect the user based on what happened, and we give them a message telling them what happened. So let's see if this all works. So first I can come here, I will close my incognito window so that I can authenticate everything from the beginning. So authorize, log in for the 6th time. Okay, so we authenticated as me. we can send a penny to somebody. Somebody give me their phone number. I'll Venmo you a penny. 219 314 7344. Okay, let's see if this works. Nope. Okay. /pay. Okay, so that ended up going to /pay. It should have gone to /Venmo/pay. So we just have a small root mismatch. So it turns out there's a subtle detail about what I said with the /pay root that does matter. Here we have action equals pay. That's only going to work if we are basically. Now it'll work. It's the dumbest thing, but because there was no trailing slash, it ended up not working. But I think now it should work. So, but just to be completely sure, we can just change this to /Venmo/pay. So anyway, I will send a penny to 219314. What was the last part? 7344. And send a payment. I can't pay yet. Oh, I forgot to reload the server. Or the server was unhappy with me.
It worked.
But you got the Venmo. Okay. So we have some bugs, but we have accomplished sending a Venmo payment. So we don't want to have bugs when we're dealing with money. So let's work those out first. But it seems like we succeeded. So it's because I forgot to delete the placeholder. That's all it was. It seems like everything else works. So somebody else give me a phone number.
954 470 6689.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. It looks like also the part where we figure out what your name is messed up. But I successfully sent a penny to you. So let's see if we can fix that and get everything to work. User dot username or dot display name? Display name. There we go. So let's restart that. Okay. Hopefully for the last try, third person.
802-236-8781.
Okay. Daniel Colson, is that your name?
It is.
Woo! There we go. Okay. I think that's all there is for this talk. Yeah, that's about it. So now you have a form. You can authenticate somebody on Venmo, and to be clear, somebody else could come up here on my computer and authenticate, and they could start sending payments. It's not just the account of you because you made the app. This can authenticate for anybody. So now people can go and use my app and send payments, or we could make the app do whatever else we want. So we have used the Venmo API.